So now after exercise 2, we got an idea about how to create a custom component. Now let's go back to our platform. So we talked about components APIs. Now let's take a little bit focus on the core elements. If you go to our directory, you will find that we have a bunch of web components or standard web components elements that are available, and you can just test them and see how they work. Those are just a screenshot bunch of them, like button, form layout, grid, combo box, and so on, split layout, charts. Now, what are those elements or how we built them? We actually used the help of Polymer. So what is Polymer exactly? Polymer is a JavaScript library for developing web components. And currently, the Vaadin core elements are all built based on Polymer 2, even though we're looking forward to upgrade them to Polymer 3 once it gets finally released. Yeah, as of right now, it's developed by Google, and Google didn't push the final version or at least beta version of Polymer 3. That's why our core elements are a little bit not confirmed to use Polymer 3, but that's something coming for sure. Polymer in itself, you can think about it as a library that helps you build web components. It helps you build standard web components and gives you a bunch of tools that make the life easier. It uses the web components standards, and also it has a very interesting JavaScript file that makes the polyfill for all browsers. So if a browser is a little bit old or a browser does not support a specific feature of standard web components, then it polyfill the needs. So how to use Polymer? You can think about tomorrow's component. DOM structure will consist of just HTML and some custom tags. No jungle of divs and spans and all those kind of things. Just very simple custom tags. And it gives you a higher abstraction level. Like for example, when you use Vaadin combo box, then you can internally reuse lower abstraction level elements. Think about it just like object-oriented programming. So to put a little bit more focus on what web components actually are, we have 4 or 5 different core concepts. I'm gonna say why they are 5. First of all, it's the HTML templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and finally HTML imports. So as of right now, because this is a work in progress standard, the first 3 of them, HTML template, custom elements, and shadow DOM, are final and standardized, and I think all browsers support them as of right now. HTML imports is something that people are considering to fade away and replace it with ES6 modules, but this is something still work in progress, even though my feeling from the community and the impression from other people is that ES6 module is going to stay and HTML imports is going to disappear. So what each of those mean exactly? Templates is something that what you see right now, just a very simple way of defining how your HTML structure will look like. You can even include some style and also some JavaScript. So just a template of how the structure of your DOM will look like. And then the custom element, which is a definition of how exactly your element will be exposed inside the browser and how other developers can use it. The only constraint that you need to put here is that it must contain a hyphen, one hyphen at least. So my-element is accepted, my-new-element is accepted, but my element as one single word is not going to be accepted. That's also for standardization purpose, to differentiate mainly between custom elements and built-in elements. Shadow DOM is something interesting that we were able to see many years ago, even before the idea of web components. For example, when you use something like the video tag, which was newly introduced in HTML5, and then you go to the browser inspector and check mark next to show shadow root, you will find that video tag is not really one single tag. It gets divided into sub tags, and you can even inspect them, that like what you see on the screen right now. I'm able to inspect the div element inside the video. And you can see like there are some span and inputs and stuff like that. So that's the shadow DOM of whatever inside the component itself. Now the good news is with the standardization of web components, all developers are going to be able to define their own tags and expose them in the browser and use them immediately without really needing a standard way or waiting for HTML6 and 7 to be introduced, for example. And finally, the HTML imports. So as of right now, what the platform is using is this kind of very simple way of importing a template inside your code. But moving forward, my feeling is that this is going to be replaced with a standard way of importing an ES6 module. The big difference is that here I'm importing an HTML file inside my DOM tree. But ES6 module is a JavaScript file, so you're going to include it as a script, not as an HTML file. So it's going to be very simple, like just how you include any other JavaScript code. But since we are talking about Vaadin 10, let's just use the HTML imports. This is something that most likely will not change in Vaadin 10 at least. So why web components? Actually, as I explained earlier, you can think about it as a way of object-oriented programming, a reusability and encapsulation and maybe inheritance also of components, some very advanced concepts of programming that you can have inside your HTML DOM tree. In practice, you can define any new tag and use it inside the browser, and it is standard. So the word standard here is very, very important, because when we say it's standard, it means that all browsers will use them and will accept them without any problems. And we're not really talking about non-native code or a third party or even a framework. We are talking here about a native layer of execution. Other advantage is that you will not need any sort of plugins, for example, or any sort of external third parties. So for example, no Flash plugin, no Java plugin, and so on. If you manage to have something inside your browser as a web component, then you can just use it right away. It gives you an isolation from other elements, talking about styles, talking about the hierarchy tree, and so on. You can also easily share it with open source available tools like NPM, Yarn. Previously, there is Bower, and you might find some Bower inside the Vaadin 10, but that's something that for sure will be cleaned up soon and removed completely. And of course, it gives you an easy integration mechanism. As of right now, the browser support is quite interesting. We see that Chrome and Opera, well, Chrome and Opera are pretty much the same. They are using the same engine, but Safari now supports script module. We're talking here about the way of how to include a template inside your DOM tree, for example. And Safari announced, or Apple announced clearly, that they will not support HTML imports, or at least not anytime soon. But right now, it's possible to get the behavior by using polyfill. Firefox has some advancement happening in the standards, and we see that also Edge is also on the way. But from this chart, we see clearly that the four main concepts of web components that are going to stay are templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and some kind of import, which is most probably going to be ES6 modules, or ES modules in general. So again, this is a big picture. We talked about component APIs, core elements. Now let's take a little bit more focus on flow. So flow is a communicator that communicates between client side and server side. You can think about it in such a way, very simple way, just a communicator tool. And it happens that you will have some kind of template on the client side, and this template doesn't have any constraints. But what I'm gonna focus on how to create the server side template to be able to communicate with the client side. So for the server side part of the Polymer element, you need to create some kind of class that extends a Polymer template. And this is how you can introduce to flow that you are trying to communicate with a template that is written in HTML or some client-side code. You can think about it as a custom component or a custom layout. You can think about it as a way to communicate between the client side and basically put any code or communication to the server side. So how does that work in practice? Basically, this is a very standard Polymer template on the client side. If you take this code and put it inside any other Polymer project, it's gonna work. This doesn't have any Vaadin related modifications whatsoever. That's just how it is. But I have here highlight that I gave some IDs to some divs, for example. I have here the DOM module itself is called my layout, which means that my custom element here is called my dash layout. And also in the is method, it's overridden by returning the name of my custom element. This is the Polymer way of how to define a custom element. So now from the Java side, we said that we need to create a class that extends Polymer template. Now, you need a couple more things, like adding, for example, the add tag. We have seen the add tag previously in the first part of this course. We said that you can use add tag to communicate with, for example, with the div tag. But here, it's gonna communicate with my custom tag, which is my dash layout. And here you can see clearly how useful it is, because my dash layout was not previously defined in Java. So now we can see how useful we can use the add tag annotation. But that's not enough, because we also need to add HTML import the actual HTML template itself. So this is how we are defining that this my template class is going to map to the HTML import. Now, if you want to define a specific component that is going to communicate with a specific element on the client side, it's very simple and straightforward, as simple as just adding an annotation at ID. So like I have here private div content area. So content area, this object is going to be mapped to the object called content area inside my template. As simple as that. If you have a little bit more complex component, then you can still map it to the corresponding component. If it's a Vaadin element, then you can define a Vaadin element and map it. If it's a custom component, then you need to define this custom component first and then map this custom component here inside your code. And then, for example, here I'm set layout content, I'm overriding it just to give you an overview about how it works. So now we talked about two parts. We talked about the client side and the server side. We have defined this and we have defined that. But you need some kind of communication that can happen between them. For example, how can you share data between them? How can you share events between client side and server side? Basically, let's talk about data first. We have something called the template model. So if you are coming from Vaadin 7 or Vaadin 8 background, you can think about it as the shared state. So this is a shared state or the data basically that is shared between the server side and the client side. And basically this is defining how the user state look like exactly. It allows you to make a communication or a connection between the client and the server. It shares automatically the state of the template. You don't really have to do anything about it. Just it's enough for you to declare an interface with the corresponding properties. And the flow will automatically serialize and deserialize the data transported between server and client. It supports serialization of POJOs, basic data types, primitives, lists, arrays, and so on. So very simple, straightforward. You don't really have to do much on that side. And the second part, which is basically the event handler. How to make event mechanism from the server side to the client side. The event handler basically allows you to expose the server-side methods for invocation from JavaScript, and it can be mixed with pure JavaScript functionalities as well. So this is an interesting example. The first two lines are basically written on the HTML template. It defines a div, and it has a function called update status. So when I click on this div, it immediately goes to this function called update status, and then the variable called status on the client side will immediately has a word called connecting to server. Now, on the server side, I have the annotation at event handler that communicate with the update status and then goes to the server side, maybe make some transaction on the client, on the server side, on the database, and then return back on the variable called status with something like confirmed on the server or something like that. So this is a difference that you can now, with Flow, you can give immediate responses. You can override the functionalities on the client side without worrying much about how slow on the server side it is, or if the server side is doing some other different behaviors. Like, for example, you want to show a loading screen, you want to show some error immediately, some checking, and so on. So this is also, again, something new that very interesting was introduced in Vaadin Flow. And finally, the element APIs. We've got a glimpse about that previously. Element APIs are basically the lowest level way of dealing with elements. It allows you to change DOM element properties from server side and allows you to create and append new DOM element to existing ones. If you are coming from Vaadin 8 background or something like that, you can think about it as GWT, except that the big difference here is that we don't use GWT. You don't need client-side compilation or anything like that. It just works immediately. So this is an example, for example, on how to use element APIs. In the downer part, you can see that I defined an element called footer element, for example, that takes the element inside the div. So I have footer div that we have seen before, but what we haven't seen before is that I'm taking the element itself and then manually append to my vertical layout this footer element. And then I can manipulate with this footer element in a very low detail, like set attribute. I can set any attribute that can exist because it's a string, so I can put anything. I also can add an event listener, for example, and so on. So this is a very low level of dealing with the API, and it allows a new generation of client-side development for Vaadin in a very easy and straightforward way. It's very flexible, as you have seen, so basically you can do anything with it. There is no constraints, and it's fully controllable from the server side. This also includes custom HTML elements and web components. So that's basically everything about Vaadin platform. We briefly discussed the component APIs, the core elements. Now, before ending this, let's just take one last exercise just to get an idea about how to deal with templates and how they work exactly.